Welcome to EXP's discussion of CIMA P3 performance strategy and express notes. Today we're going to talk about risk response strategies. The context here is that any business organization needs to know, needs to identify, needs to assess the sorts of risks that it faces in its business activities, taken in the broadest sense. And today we want to run through some of the categories within which a company should define its so-called risk response strategy. Now there are four generic headings which cover this, and we need to be acquainted with them. One risk response strategy is to avoid the risk altogether. In other words, the risk involved in a certain business undertaking, such as offshore oil drilling, may not be to the company's liking, and therefore a company may choose to limit its activities to onshore exploration because it does not want to be faced with this type of risk. Another thing that a company can do is to accept the risk, but to reduce it as much as possible, or to mitigate the risk. In other words, taking certain actions to reduce the risk. This can be anything from proper internal procedures and policies governing behavior to make sure that the risk is kept to a minimum, or in the financial risk area to engage in certain hedging transactions to avoid exposures, but to mitigate exposures perhaps would be the proper term to use here. Or a third way would be to have this risk insured by a third party. In other words, to actually transfer the risk away from oneself, or possibly to share it, for example, with a joint venture partner. And finally, the risk may be so small that it's not worth worrying about, and therefore the company decides to accept it. In the context of the risk map, which was discussed earlier, one can look at the risk map in the context of the four responses which are shown here. Now, we need to come back to a point which deserves important emphasis, and that is the connection between risk and corporate objectives. The idea is that a company consciously understands that it has to accept a certain level of risk in order to achieve its business objectives. And therefore, the objectives, starting with the mission statement of a company and its key objectives and strategies which result from these objectives, have to be clearly defined before one can really analyze the risks that are connected to them. One has to have a working basis as to what the company exists for and what its objectives are, in order to meaningfully determine what sort of risks are connected to the attainment of the objectives, what strategies are possible given the sorts of risks that exist, and whether these risks are appropriate and acceptable to the company. So there has to be a clear understanding of the company's objectives in order to determine what level of risks may be entertained. This is a very important connection. The reason for this is that we have to keep in mind that as a company pursues its objectives, it is taking risks, but of course it's taking risks as a necessary part of trying to achieve returns. So the risk-return relationship in business is a very important one, that one would not enter into higher risks unless there was a promise of higher returns. Companies and individuals who are very risk-averse will settle for modest returns because they don't want to face the risks. People who like to gamble, for example, accept high risks because they're hoping for high returns. And in the same way, A company cannot leave the risk return or risk reward equation to take care of itself. They must explicitly confront this and address it through a determination of what level of risks the company is willing to accept, what kind of appetite it has for risks, if you will. There follows, therefore, from this discussion, the importance of defining risk management processes. In any well-functioning company will have an explicit set of risk management processes that have been well thought through, well designed, that are appropriate to the objectives of the company, and which are communicated throughout the organization so that people understand and can adhere to the expectations of a risk management process. These include the following: risk identification and awareness. So identifying the risks is sort of an intellectual kind of exercise that one goes through, but throughout the daily business operations of a company, everybody should be aware of the risks and should be seeking to minimize them. Of course, having identified risks, it's up to risk management to actually assess these risks. In other words, to quantify what the impacts will be, to evaluate them with regard to prioritizing them and seeing to what degree such risks are constitute a severe or a real threat to the company or not. And then as a next step, there has to be, as we have discussed already, the formulation of a response to these risks, and of course the implementation and controlling of these risks. Once this is implemented, of course, there follows the necessity of monitoring and having a reporting structure in place so that senior management doesn't simply feel good because no news is good news. They have to have actual confirmation that risks are being confronted and are being managed throughout the organization. Now, from CIMA's perspective, and this is actually quite interesting, CIMA's risk management cycle is certainly worth looking for, and it can be found on the CIMA global website, because CIMA has actually quite a lot of useful stuff to say about risk management. Also important to the student of risk management processes is to be aware of COSO, the so-called Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. That's quite a mouthful, but this is an entity which was set up a number of years ago, which has made its specialty the definition of, study of, and treatment of enterprise risks in general, and the processes of enterprise risk management. And this is very interesting, and many companies choose to follow the COSO system or framework of enterprise risk management because COSO is regarded to be a real trend setter in this area and is setting the highest standards of enterprise risk management. Now, the components of the COSO framework are the ones you see here. Internal environment addresses itself to the general environment of the company, particularly with regard to the people's awareness and attitude towards risks. And also important is the attitude of senior management and the tone at the top. In other words, how seriously is management taking the importance of risk management through the organization. That really sets the scene, because risk management is only given importance if it's emphasized at the top. The next component at COSO is the objective setting, and here the concern is to make sure that the objectives of the organization are properly aligned and consistent with the risk appetite that the organization has. Event identification, as we've alluded to in earlier, has to do with identifying those risks which can harm or affect the achievement of the objectives that the company has set itself. Then there's risk assessment. It's the process by which risks are analyzed and prioritized and quantified and so on to understand what is the way in which they could be managed. The risk response is what we have already talked about in terms of choosing to avoid, accept, reduce, or share the risk. And the control activities would represent or be reflected in the policies and procedures that are designed to make sure that the risk responses are properly implemented. Then, of course, there is an important sharing of relevant information through the organization, that the information is identified and communicated in a timely way to the people who need to carry out their responsibilities with regard to risk management. And then, of course, the whole system itself of monitoring has to be put into place, and modifications made as going forward, because again, risk management systems are evolving systems, because the environment, the external environment, is always changing. One can also see that the objectives of the CASO framework are concerned with strategic level issues, operations within the company, to make sure that the financial reporting is truthful and accurate and one of integrity, and that compliance exists with regard to laws and regulations. Thank you.